Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth event of Democracy Matters. I'm Ran, a professor of economics here at Stanford, and I'm again delighted that so many of you are able to join us today. I have to say that it makes me very happy to see how this event series is bringing together the Stanford community, not just the undergraduate students, but also graduate students, staff members, faculty, postdocs, and alumni. Now, in the past few weeks, we talked about some of the challenges facing democracy in the US and about the various challenges posed by COVID-19. Today, we shift gear and we are going to talk about inequality. Now, this is obviously a very big topic, and it is also an important issue in the upcoming elections. The US has traditionally been viewed as a land of opportunity, a country where people of all backgrounds can succeed with hard work and strong determination. But over the last few decades, there has been an increase in income inequality in the US, and many people are wondering whether and how we can create a more equal society. Some emphasize equality of opportunities, and others talk about more equality of incomes. Today, I'm honored to have four great colleagues and experts to weigh in on this challenge of inequality. I asked Deborah Satz from philosophy to talk about what, if anything, is wrong with income inequality. Michael Boskin from economics will talk about income inequality and whether we should aim to reduce it. David Grusky from sociology will talk about inequality and the American dream. And Florencia Torch from sociology will discuss higher education and income inequality. So this really should be a great event. As always, each speaker will give a 10 minutes presentation and we will follow with Q&A from the audience. The way for you to ask questions is to just use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You should feel free to type questions throughout the event and we will ask as many of them as possible at the end of the presentations. So our first speaker today is Deborah Satz. Deborah is the Martha Sutton Weeks Professor of Ethics in Society and a Professor of Philosophy at Stanford. Deborah is a prolific and award-winning scholar. She has published 4 books and many dozens of articles. Her research focuses on the ethical limits of markets, on issues around equality and inequality, and on the relationship between economic policy and moral philosophy. Deborah is also an incredible teacher, the winner of Stanford's highest teaching award, the Gores Award for Excellence in Teaching. She won this award, and I quote, for her extraordinary teaching that combines the importance of rigorous thought with serious engagement in the moral dilemmas facing humanity. And of course, in her spare time, Deborah is the Dean of the School of Humanities and Sciences at Stanford. Now, working with her closely over the last few months, I can tell you that Deborah is not just a great teacher and a great scholar, she's also a great person. And she's leading the school with integrity, with commitment, and with grace. So welcome, Deborah, and thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you, and thank you for having me and for this great series. What I'd like to do is start where Ron posed this issue of growing inequality in the United States over the last 5 decades. And one way to think about it that I find helpful is to think of the United States as an apartment building. And over the last 5 decades, the penthouse apartments have gotten larger and larger. The apartments on the very high floors have gotten somewhat better, but not grown as much as the penthouses. And the apartments on the lower floors have been basically worn down, not really improving much. And in addition, the penthouse apartments now have separate elevators that go straight to the top, so they don't need to really mingle or see much of the people living on the lower floors. And of course, some people don't even get into the building in the first place, whether by law or by social conventions. There are people who, or by income, can't even get into the early floors. And so one question that comes up is, why should we care about the shape of the spaces in the apartment building? And one obvious question or one obvious rejoinder to thinking we should care about the relative size of the different apartments is to think, look, what really matters is that all the apartments are adequate. And if all the apartments were adequate, the fact that some apartments are better than others, right, wouldn't really be a cause for moral concern. And that's what I really want to talk about in my 10 minutes is there are quite a number of people who think the real question, the real point of moral concern is poverty, not inequality. And if we could reduce poverty, then there would be, and if we were able by some miracle to have no more poor people, there really wouldn't be any reason in particular to care about inequality, particularly income and wealth inequality. And I think that's a mistake. And I want to give you some reasons for thinking that concerns with poverty, which are pressing and critical concerns, don't exhaust the scope of our moral concern. And I'll just mention two framing pieces. It may be that poverty and inequality are connected. So it might be that if you are concerned about eliminating poverty, you ought to be concerned about inequality. There are very few examples of societies that have been able, I think Switzerland might be an exception where you have a reduction of poverty, but still very high income differentials, but you might think there's a causal link. I will also say that a poverty line, how you define it, might be relatively determined, so that what counts as an adequate living space might depend on what kinds of spaces other people have. Adam Smith has a wonderful comment that what everybody needs is the ability to appear in public without shame. And what it takes to appear in public without shame might depend on what other people have. For example, Adam Smith thought in his day it included a linen shirt. It wouldn't be enough to just have a linen shirt and nothing else on in our day. And so it might be that you can't separate fully the issues of poverty from the issues of inequality. But I'm going to put that aside because I do think there are some reasons independent of concerns about poverty that we should care about inequality. And I'll just say a couple of things about the notion or the concept of equality, because I'm sure this will come up in our discussion. So equality, unlike a threshold line, a poverty line, is comparative. When I'm concerned about equality, I'm concerned about what other people have relative to others. So I'm concerned about the distribution of those apartments and not just whether or not the bottom apartments are adequate. Equality is also indifferent as to level. So you can have equality at a very low level and equality at very high levels. And obviously, equality then can't exhaust our concern because if everybody is extremely poor or everybody is blind, it's very hard to think that's a virtue of a society. And the third point about equality is, and this is a point Amartya Sen has made a lot of correctly, we are unequal in so many ways that whenever we're talking about equality, we have to talk about what kinds of equality are we concerned about. We're not particularly concerned about equality of height. Equality of income, to the extent it matters, it's hard to see why it would matter in itself. Like the fact that somebody has more green bills than I have is not by itself a cause of concern. But instead, I think the apartments, that some people have bigger apartments than others, not in itself a cause of concern. It's a cause of concern, I'm going to argue, for what the consequences of that inequality are, or what the causes of the inequality are. So let me try to run through very rapidly a couple of reasons for being concerned about inequality. So one is we could be concerned about inequalities of income and wealth in America because we're concerned about the processes that have given rise to them. So to the extent that we think, for example, a robber takes a lot of money from me, has more money, but when we look at that, we look at the process that's created it. And if we think the process is unfair or unjust, then we're going to be concerned about the inequality because we're concerned about how it came about. And to the extent that we think the rules of the game have been rigged in various ways, whether because of unequal power or because of a monopoly and returns to scale that distort the kind of processes of inclusion and equality that are generated by a market. If we think those are tainted in some way, then we're going to be concerned about the inequality. People respond very differently to inequalities that they think are the result, let's say, of hard work, and those inequalities that are the result of either random events that are just chance or some kind of cheating or rigging. So one reason we might care about those apartments is maybe we think it's been rigged. Who gets access to those apartments? But a second set of reasons, and maybe as important, if not more important, are the consequences of various kinds of inequality. And let me quickly mention three different causes. And I would say one way to think about these is that they're democratic. So one reason we might be concerned about inequalities of income and wealth is, as Ron mentioned, we care about equality of opportunity. We care about the missing, what Raj Chetty's called the missing Einsteins, the fact that zip code or class origin determines what happens to people, right? That we're not living in a democratic society, but in a caste-like society where the social class you're born into determines largely what happens to you in life. That would be a concern when inequalities get so great and operate in such a way that people are basically confined to the position that they are born into. So that's a reason if we think inequality of income and wealth has led to declining social mobility and declining equality of opportunity, that would be a reason to be concerned. A second reason to be concerned is the idea of democracy, is the idea that everybody has essentially a fair opportunity for political voice, and that the amount of money that you have should not be a determining factor in your ability to have your voice heard or to be able to occupy political office. But if you look at the data on who's listened to in the political process and who winds up being able to run for high offices and get elected, economic inequality is a very significant consequence. So my third consequence to be considered in evaluating inequality is that some forms of inequality represent a failure of reciprocity. So reciprocity requires that those who benefit from the efforts of others should provide those benefits equivalently to those others if they have the capacity and opportunity to do so. And reciprocity is a pretty strongly, as far as we can tell, built into human nature, that people care a lot about people not riding free or taking unfair advantage of other people. And we know even experimentally that people are willing to devote some of their own resources to punish exploiters and non-cooperators. And a worrying feature of the kind of inequality that we are seeing in the United States is the extent to which it seems not to represent a commitment to reciprocity. So go back to the apartment building, where some of the apartments are just gorgeous and getting more and more beautiful, while other departments are being run down. Why is that happening? We have had, over the last 30 years, economic growth, but that economic growth has not been distributed in a manner which I think acknowledges the importance of reciprocity. Many people who work and contribute to our society have seen almost no benefit. In fact, some people have seen absolutely no benefit from those 30 years of growth, while other people have seen enormous benefits flowing to them. And I think that growth without reciprocity represents a kind of unfairness and also gives rise to the question, why is this happening? Why is it that we can't improve all of the building and not just the apartments at the very top? And so if you think about the design of an apartment building as a model for thinking about inequality, you should be concerned about not only the growing gaps in the apartment size and quality that we are seeing, the inability of people to move between apartments, to rise up and also to fall down, so that birth does, or inheritance, birth does not determine destiny. The inability to affect the processes that are leading to the unequal, the highly unequal equipping of these apartments. And then the failure that happens when people live such disconnected lives from each other. And I said, our apartment building now has separate elevators where rich and poor do not live in a common, do not share a common life. And that is a huge problem. It's a huge problem from the point of view of democracy, because one of the strengths of a democracy is our ability to exchange and share information across our differences. And when we're not doing that, we are making decisions, and we're in danger of making decisions that leave some people totally out of the mix. And so that's my the third feature I wanted to underscore today. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Deborah. This was very insightful. And our next speaker is Michael Boskin. Mike is a professor of economics here at Stanford, as well as a senior fellow at CIPR and at Hoover. He is also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Mike is the author of more than 100 articles and books. He's internationally recognized for his research on world economic growth, on tax and budget theory and policy, on social security, and on US saving and consumption patterns. Now, Mike served as chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors from 1989 to 1993. And he also chaired this highly influential Blue Ribbon Commission on the Consumer Price Index. And the report of this commission has transformed the way government statistical agencies around the world measure inflation and GDP and productivity and so on. He has also served as advisors to governments and businesses globally, as well as on several corporate and philanthropic boards of directors. Now, Mike has received many awards, including Stanford's Distinguished Teaching Award, the Medal of the President of the Italian Republic for his contributions to global economic understanding, and the Adam Smith Prize for outstanding contributions to economics. And importantly, Mike has been a great colleague to me at the economics department, and so thanks a lot for joining, Mike.
My pleasure, Ran. It goes both ways, obviously. Well, hello, everyone. I'm going to try to frame this the way economists think about inequality issues. I'm going to put up a variety of slides that will go through some issues when you think about trying to measure the degree of inequality and trends over time. I'm going to focus on what we might want to be concerned about. I'll then lay out what I think are a series of 9 facts, despite all the partisan toing and froing and the cherry picking of data and so on, and going from cyclical trough to peak or vice versa to get the data to show what you want. What I think about 90% of economists would agree are the facts of what's been going on, and try to explain them a bit, and then I'll offer some conclusions in my own policy preferences to improve these issues. So Tiffany, if you want to put up the slides, that would be great. So let me start by just saying, if you want to go about trying to measure people's incomes or consumption, we have to, what's the distribution of what are we concerned about? Income in the marketplace, wages, income after taxes and transfers, which is quite different, consumption, what people are actually able to purchase, more closely related to their current standard of living and perhaps their long-run standard of living, wealth, as Deborah mentioned, mobility over time. I think it's also intergenerationally is important, and intergenerational equity is something that gets lost because a lot of the policies we're pursuing are moving in the wrong direction in regard to intergenerational equity. What's the unit of measurement? Households, family, individuals. Many different studies use different measures, and they can make a big difference. I'll say why in a second. Time period, you want to look at annual. Most people look at a snapshot at a point in time. The distribution over a longer period of time is less unequal, still quite unequal. Do we look separately by cohort? Do we want to look at successive cross sections, for example, from successive censuses? Do we want to follow people longitudinally or even intergenerationally, as some people are now attempting to do? And how comprehensive a measure? Most studies are quite non-comprehensive in what they measure. The economist comprehensive measure is called Haig-Simons, after two famous economists in the 1930s that defined how we measure these things. But most people look at things like adjusted gross income on tax returns, which leave out vast numbers of things. In consumption, most studies of consumer expenditures leave out owner-occupied housing, which is 1/6 of personal income. And in wealth, there are lots of issues, including major changes in tax laws saw major swings in whether wealth showed up on individual tax returns or state and corporations. And so even the IRS says you can't compare data before and after certain dates. Some issues that particular problems are non-cash transfers like Medicaid, unpaid non-market work, for example. People working in the home, if they went to work in the marketplace and hired people to replace them in the home, they would look richer, but maybe there would not be much of a net change. Tax-deferred retirement account withdrawals are becoming much more important and are hard to measure. Capital gains, the gain particularly in stock and other closely held businesses or art or other things, homes, are not well measured or are taken at a snapshot in time, which are bunched quite a bit more than the accrued capital gains. And importantly, adjusting these things for size, taking account of economies of scale and home production and consumption. Some people just use households, some take per capita. I tend to use a more robust, more complex thing that takes account of the nature of scale economies as family size increases. Temporal price changes, it's well known that most of the studies saying there's been no gain in incomes or wages are quite wrong because they use a highly suspect consumer price index that has substantially understated inflation for a long period of history by over a percentage point a year, which accumulates to a lot over a decade. Even the IRS now, the Bureau of Labor Statistics now has a new CPI that they use, but they never go back and correct the old ones when they make changes. So you have to be very careful about that. And importantly, spatial differences. We know how expensive it is to live in the Stanford area. California is a very high cost of living state. It also has households that are 20% larger on average in size than the national average. So 20% higher prices, roughly 20% higher, larger family size. You can be way off. And in fact, when you adjust for those things, unfortunately, California has by far the highest poverty rate in the country, according to the Census Bureau. There are many data sources, the census, IRS tax data, Social Security, special surveys that are done that economists tend to use a lot. Some even have time use studies, so you can start to get some sense of the value of people working in the home. And increasingly, surveys are being linked to administrative data. And international data, there's a Luxembourg income study that tends to get used a lot, although it's very spotty, it's not harmonized very well, and it's very spotty of coverage at different points in time. Each of these has strengths, weaknesses, limitations. So just all I'm trying to urge you is to be careful when you hear person X saying A and person Y saying B. They both could be correct, but they're talking about somewhat different things. And if you're not paying attention, you wouldn't realize. Let's go on. So what should we be concerned about? First, as Deborah mentioned, ex-ante opportunity versus ex-post outcomes. For a long period, Americans seem to be overwhelmingly concerned with ex-ante opportunity. More recently, there seems to be a demand to focus more on ex-post outcomes. Should we be concerned about overall inequality, as Deborah argued, or one or both tails? Absolute or relative income and consumption. I wrote a paper that was widely cited that looked at the consequences for the design of an optimal tax transfer system when people cared about their relative income. And that's one of only 2 cases where you could get a considerably larger redistribution being desirable. Market income, post-tax and transfer income, wages, consumption, wealth, inequality or the lack of improvement in wages or income. That's really important. Stability or mobility. People seem particularly averse to declines in their standard of living more than anything else. And that should be for individuals, households, or across generations. Distributional ethics run across incentive effects. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but importantly, there's an equity versus efficiency and growth trade-off, which I'll show you in a moment. We can be a more equal society, but back up please, almost certainly it will mean that we'll have lower standards of living than we otherwise would have had. That's a trade-off we have to intelligently balance. Ex-post equality versus levels of income is related. So let's take a look at some things that are important to get across. And this goes to the growth issue. So the OECD has long done many studies, and they have increasingly decided that corporate income taxes are the most harmful to economic growth, personal income next, and then consumption taxes. And when we compare ourselves to other societies, Scandinavia, Western Europe in general, other countries, et cetera, almost all of them rely much more heavily on regressive consumption taxes, which is why even after the Trump tax changes, the US has the most progressive tax system in the OECD. That's not commonly known, but it's a basic fact, okay? I'll come back to that in a minute. Another basic fact that's not known is how much the price that some countries pay to be considerably more egalitarian. After-tax per capita income in the US is 50% larger than in Denmark and Sweden. Now, some of that higher taxes they pay purchase things that Swedes and Danes want, including a more liberal in its generosity and in its application across the population social welfare system. So this is not the only measure, but it's just indicates that there are trade-offs that have to be considered. And speaking about inequality without thinking about this misses a big part of the story. And as Deborah indicated, we wouldn't love a more equal society if we were all poor. We also wouldn't like a quite unequal society if many people were rich and other people were getting by, but just barely, okay? So what are some major trends that have occurred and we can agree on our facts? Starting around 1980, we can argue about a few years in that regard. The skill premium and wages grew substantially, say between college educated and non-college educated. Slower growth, not decline, in real wages in recent decades were due to biased technical change, bias toward skills and capital. Globalization, the opening up of China and the former Soviet Union collapsing, which added hundreds of millions of people able to produce traded goods in the global economy, which inexorably put downward pressure on wages in the advanced economy, particularly of less skilled workers there. And labor market demographics, when you look over a span of time, as the baby boomers are retiring, older, higher paid workers are stepping out of the labor force, being replaced by relatively smaller cohorts of younger workers, so naturally there'd be some effect. Conditioning all that and on proper measurement of prices, wages had grown slowly, not declined, but far less rapidly than the several decades after World War II. Should we be concerned about overall inequality measures? They've increased almost everywhere. I'll show you a picture in a second through the mid to late 2000s since 1980. After long periods of stability, labor share in income has declined. Economists have long loved models because they were simple mathematically, where labor share stayed constant, but that's fallen by the wayside. The change has mostly been in the upper half of the income distribution, not the bottom half. There's been a relative increase in income and wealth at the top. That's indisputable, although overstated by some, getting a lot of attention. There's been a tremendous increase in transfer payments and programs, both cash and in kind, and there's now a huge and growing unfunded entitlement program liability, so think Social Security and Medicare in the US, projected to balloon the national debt and projected to stick future generations with higher taxes. There's been limited progress in the war on poverty since it was enacted in the 60s, despite the proliferation of anti-poverty programs. And inequality in disposable income, after you take account of the taxes people pay and the transfers they get from the government in cash and in kind, while still substantial, is much less than the usually quoted market income inequality, and these may have diverged after the Great Recession. So let's take a real quickly through some pictures. This is declining labor share in all major economies. Next. Transfers are now 2.5 times larger as a share of personal income than they were several decades ago. The shaded areas of recession, they balloon in recessions and they don't fall all the way back. They keep ratcheting up. That may be a good thing, but that's just a fact. This is the national debt, which has doubled since before the Great Recession. President Obama ran the largest high employment deficits of any president since World War II, and President Trump has topped that even prior to COVID. And these are the projections in the Congressional Budget Office. We have 79 anti-poverty programs. They spend $1.2 billion, and if you added Social Security and Medicare, the part that goes to low-income people or poor people, that number could well be double that amount. And 1 in 5 people participate in at least one government means-tested program, and a larger fraction will at some point in their life. And there's a lot of problems of fraud at both tails. There's a large tax gap of unpaid income taxes among the wealthy, and there's a lot of fraud in these transfer payment programs, especially the ones that dispense cash. Income inequality, the Gini index, the higher the number, the less equal the society is, has increased virtually everywhere from the mid-'80s to the late 2000s, which immediately tells us, along with those declining labor share slide, it can't be due primarily to the policies of one country. If you dislike Bush and Trump's tax cuts, or Clinton and Obama's tax hikes, or Obamacare, or you love them or whatever, they are not the main reason this has occurred. However, an untold story is the tremendous progress we've made in reducing global abject poverty. There's never, the last several decades, you might call them capitalist decades for good or ill, have unleashed forces, including global trade, that have lifted more people and a larger fraction of the world's population out of abject poverty than any time in human history. It's a tremendous achievement. This is mixing everybody up in the world regardless of where they are. The previous slide is by country, which obviously is far more salient for the politics of policy. Okay. Now let's take a quick look at this. Net transfers are the transfers you get from the government, federal, state, and local, minus the taxes you pay. So this top line is the bottom quartile, and this shows that at the far right, by 2017, the net transfers had tripled their market income. They're related. Transfers get super generous. Some people won't work as much, et cetera. The bottom one, the far right, minus 35% is the top 1%. So taxes net of transfers, and the rich do get some transfers, including Social Security, have taken 1/3 of their market income away from them. So those are just some basic facts. The next slide will show you that the bottom part is the distribution of disposable income after taxes and transfers versus market income at the top. Market income inequality is much larger and has grown since 2007, while slightly the reverse has occurred in disposable income. Okay. There's some more optimistic trends recently. After the slowest recovery since World War II, the last 3 years have seen the biggest improvement in overall incomes, far more than twice as much as in the previous 8 years. And the last 2 years reduced inequality. Next slide, bullet, please. Wages rose most rapidly recently at the bottom, as did incomes, even wealth, and the gaps between college-educated and not whites and minorities narrowed. They're still substantial, but they narrowed. Poverty rate was the lowest in 60 years in 2019 pre-COVID, including for minorities. And COVID recession undoubtedly reversed these improvements, as the people who've been laid off have been predominantly lower wage workers, are slowest to get their jobs back. But most economists believe that much of this will be transitory. There will be some permanent scars from this, but it's mostly transitory. Okay, so this shows poverty at 10.5%, the lowest in many decades. And the biggest decline among the elderly, from 28% to 9%. So what are policies to promote inclusive prosperity? By far the most important, if you take nothing away from this, but this point, the most important point to promote prosperity inclusively is strong economic growth and a tight labor market. President Kennedy was fond of saying, a rising tide lifts all boats. That was as usual for presidents hyperbolic. My amendment is, it lifts by far the most boats, leaves far the fewest stranded or sunk, and gives us the resources to assist and support people who cannot support themselves. The current tax system is most progressive. Economists use alternative ethical frameworks to analyze and set up mathematical models about how to design optimal tax transfer systems. Utilitarian, tracing to Mill and Bentham. Rawls to Harvard's John Rawls. Lockean, a man's entitled, natural law, a man's entitled to the fruits of his labor. They lead to very different analyses, and I've laid out how to think about it in the appendix. Different attitudes toward earning income and transfers among the population for those who are able to work. And survey data think that Americans think inequality has worsened, but are very leery about the federal government doing something about it. A majority think they shouldn't try. They've lost so much trust in the federal government, a deeply unfortunate thing. And about 1/3 is an appropriate maximum tax rate, probably average, not marginal. Transfers have grown substantially, but importantly, they're a much smaller share of GDP than in Europe's unequal, but much lower average income societies. And Social Security has been the greatest poverty reducer by 20 times any other anti-poverty programs. So let's conclude the next ones. Incentive effects make it problematic for major expansions because when you do so, you seriously impair incentives to work and save and invest in human capital. You have to be very careful about that, or you'll harm the growth of the economy. You'll harm people's ability to get jobs and move up the ladder. And importantly, you'll leave future generations poorer off than they otherwise would have been. So there's a balancing act that has to occur there. We need to improve current programs by consolidating, modernizing, and better targeting. I shouldn't be eligible for Social Security given my income, but I choose not to get it because I don't think I should, but if I, to my wife's chagrin, by the way, but if I did, I get twice the poverty rate. And the important thing is that it should be targeted at people who really need it. Education reforms are vital, but to give an example, for Social Security, we should slow growth for upper income people while dealing with the unfunded liabilities. I would also increase benefits at the bottom to finally realize Franklin Roosevelt's dream of the original purpose of Social Security to, quote, secure a measure of protection for poverty-ridden old age. We have 46 job training programs in the federal government across 9 agencies costing $20 billion a year. Many don't even track what happens to the people who go through them. They do a very poor job. This is one example. We should have 3 or 5 good programs related to jobs in the marketplace that actually help many more people. So there's ample opportunity in addition to whatever resources, whatever additional taxes demography may be pressing us toward in the future. We need to do better in what we're spending money on now to free up those resources for higher priority things, including addressing inequality concerns. Most economists think universal basic income, besides doubling the budget, is problematical for incentive reasons. My view is we now need to start thinking about subsidizing wages at the bottom with something, if you want to think about how to do that, think generically about something like a negative payroll tax. We tried that experimentally with a negative income tax. I also think we need to tax a broader base of economic activity and people, by the way, and keep rates as low as possible to fund the necessary functions of government adequately. It's important to appreciate that a successful society needs an effective government doing the things we need government to do well and adequately funded. So when I think of this, I think of 5 big picture tests. This is where I'll end. First, will the tax and transfer reform improve, worsen the efficiency and or equity of the economy? Or how are they trading those off? Will it affect the size of government? Will it affect federalism? Will a new tax and transfer structure likely endure? We've basically been vacillating back and forth, higher and lower taxes for many administrations now at the federal level. And over time, will a tax and transfer reform contribute to a prosperous, stable democracy in which I think improving the well-being of people who have not yet made it on the economic ladder will be important. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mike, for this great presentation. And next, I am happy to welcome David Grusky. David is the Barbara Kimball Browning Professor in the School of Humanities and Sciences, a professor of sociology, and a senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. In short, David is one of the world experts on inequality in the United States. His research examines changes in the amount, type, and sources of inequality, and he has published 5 books and many dozens of articles. And I know David is now working on the 5th edition of the Inequality in the 21st Century Reader, which is a collection of the latest and most influential contributions on economic inequality, social mobility, educational inequality, racial and ethnic relations, as well as gender inequality. David is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and has received many awards, including the prestigious Max Weber Award. David is also the director of the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality, which is an inspirational center dedicated to monitoring trends in poverty and inequality, explaining what's driving these trends, and developing science-based policy on poverty and inequality. So welcome, David, and thank you very much for being here.
Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'll get right to it. Okay, so I'm going to begin as lots of people should begin with the Pope. He's an inveterate tweeter, and here's a tweet that caught my eye: "Inequality is the root of social evil." Now, if you're not the Pope, that's probably more of a hypothesis than a claim, and it's a complicated claim, and I want to unpack it a bit. Here's what I think. A social scientist would make of that tweet. A social scientist would think that extreme inequality has many unintended consequences. It may reduce total economic output, it may undermine democracy, it may reduce social mobility. That's the holy trinity, as it were, of unintended consequences. I'm going to focus on the last one, the possibility that extreme inequality may reduce social mobility. Now, if it does reduce social mobility, that's a worry, that's a problem, because it cuts to the heart, to the very heart of the American dream. So what do we mean by the American dream? It's a two-part dream, I'd say, 2 main components to it. The first one is the absolute mobility component, and it says that each new generation of children should make more than their parents. The second part is the relative mobility component, and it says that all children, no matter how rich or poor their parents may be, all children should have the same opportunity to get ahead. I'm going to focus first and mainly on the absolute mobility component, but I'll also conclude a bit by talking about relative mobility and the extent to which extreme inequality may be affecting it as well. So I'm going to be drawing heavily on a paper that I wrote with Raj Chetty, Max Hell, Nathan Hendren, Robert Manduka, and Jimmy Narang. And in this paper, we make the case that we ought to care a lot about absolute mobility because it rests on the view that parents are a very important benchmark in trying to understand how we're faring. Let me show you what I mean by this by taking the case of Joe Biden and how we might go about calculating absolute income mobility for Joe Biden. I'm using Joe Biden because he anchors one end of the time series that we draw upon in this paper, the early part of that time series, the 1940 birth cohort. So if we wanted to calculate income mobility for Joe Biden, absolute income mobility for Joe Biden, we'd first take a look at the household income of Joe's parents when his parents were about 30 years old. That happens to be in 1945. We'd write that household income down, and then we'd compare it to the household income of Joe when he's about 30 years old, which happens to be in 1973. So if Joe's income is higher than that of his parents, he's counted as upwardly mobile. It's a very simple calculation. It can't get simpler than that. Now, I should say that putting together the data that are needed in order to affect those calculations is a bit of a trick, and I'm not going to be talking about that. I'm just going to go right to the results. The calculation itself, however, is rather simple. So what do we find? We're going to start with the 1940 birth cohort. This is Joe Biden's birth cohort. And as I said, it anchors the beginning of the time series in which we'll be exploring the evolution of absolute income mobility. So on this chart, on the x-axis, is the percentile into which members of that 1940 birth cohort were born. So on the left, you have the very bottom of the household income distribution, the first percentile, and then you can move all the way to the right of that x-axis, and you'll have the very top, the so-called 1%. So that's the x-axis. The y-axis is simply the proportion of those children born into that percentile who are absolutely mobile in the sense in which I just defined it. So let's take a look at what happens at the 20th percentile. These are kids who are near the poverty threshold. And what you see here is that if you're born into the 20th percentile in the 1940 birth cohort, you have a 93% chance of making more than your parents. Pretty good odds. But it gets a bit harder, of course, when you move into the higher income percentiles. Your parents are making more. And as you see here, there is a bit of a drop in your chances of making more than your parents if you're born instead into the 95th percentile. But still, these are good odds. 84% of such children make more than their parents. So if you average across all 100 percentiles, you get a 92% chance of absolute mobility. And this is the American dream, at least as defined with respect to absolute mobility, realized. Almost everyone was upwardly mobile. So now let's move on and carry out the same calculations for the 1950 birth cohort, the 1960 birth cohort, the 1970 birth cohort, and then finally the 1980 birth cohort, which comes as close as we can to the birth cohort into which many people attending this class might have been born. And what we see is a steady deterioration in the amount of absolute mobility that's observed. So in the 1980 birth cohort, if you're born into the 20th percentile, you now have a 57% chance of absolute mobility, down from 93% in the 1940 birth cohort. If you're born instead into the 95th percentile, you have a 27% chance of absolute mobility, down from 84%. And if you average across all percentiles, you have a 50% chance of absolute mobility. The American dream is reduced now to a coin flip. Now, those numbers that I just gave you are simply the average across all population groups, and you might reasonably expect some heterogeneity around that mean, and you might, in particular, worry that the decline in absolute mobility might be more pronounced for, say, Black Americans. If you had that worry, you'd be right to have that worry. In a paper written by Maximilian Hell and Michelle Jackson, a paper that's just been finished and is as yet unpublished, they affect that comparison, and they show that indeed there's a starker decline in absolute mobility for Black Americans, and that's driven in part by the takeoff in mass incarceration and the consequent increase in inequality within the Black population. That then leads us to the question of whether or not, and this is the Pope's question, whether or not rising income inequality is to blame for this decline in absolute mobility. And you might well think it is. It's very plausible that it is. We are, as has been discussed, living in a country that's much more unequal now than was the case in 1940. And you might well think that if you distribute economic growth somewhat more broadly, there's a chance for a larger swath of Americans to then push past the threshold of their parents' income level. So you might well think that rising income inequality is going to be a problem here insofar as you care about high rates of absolute mobility. But you might also think that a simpler story is to be had, namely that the real problem is we don't have a level of economic growth now, as was the case in 1940. That was a period in history which over the next 30 years, there was substantial economic expansion, and that in and of itself would do good work in terms of ensuring that lots of people are able to surpass their parents. So we want to see which of these two forces are more important, as it were, insofar as we want to push back to the higher levels of absolute mobility that prevailed in the past. So here's the setup. The red line, as shown here, pertains to the rates of absolute mobility which I just discussed that prevailed in 1980. And you can see, of course, that the red line is much lower than the blue line, which pertains to rates of absolute mobility as they pertain in 1940. So we want to get that red line closer to the blue line. And the question is, can we do it by pushing on economic growth and restoring levels of growth that prevailed in the past? Or is it more important to restore a more equal distribution of that growth? So the first thing we do is take the 1980 empirical income distribution, but now give children a level of growth that prevailed in 1940, a very high rate of growth. And then we recalculate on the assumption that the growth isn't what was actually observed for that 1980 birth cohort, but instead equals what was the case in 1940. What we see is we make some headway. We get that line closer to the blue line, but we only get about a third of the way there. What if next we say economic growth will be as it is, relatively low as compared to what was the case for the 1940 birth cohort, but we're going to distribute that growth much more broadly. We're going to, in fact, distribute it in the way that it was distributed in 1940. So we let growth be what it is, but now we say it's going to be widely distributed growth. If we do that, if we affect that change, we can see that the rate of absolute mobility gets much closer to the blue line. So what's the upshot? The upshot is that inequality matters a lot for absolute mobility. And it's really inefficient. If you care about maximizing the amount of absolute mobility, it's really inefficient to give all the growth to the top. If you gave all the growth to the person at the very top of the income distribution, that person would, of course, vastly exceed their parent's income, but it wouldn't ensure a very high rate overall of absolute mobility. You do far better taking such growth as you have and distributing it widely and broadly, ensuring that a large swath of Americans push past the threshold defined by their parents' income. Okay, so that's the story on absolute mobility, but remember it was a two-part dream. It's a dream. The American dream is also a dream that pertains to relative mobility. And that's a different question is embedded when one takes on the question of relative mobility. So let's turn to that just briefly. I'm not going to talk about it at length, but I want to discuss it briefly. And I want to make it clear that we are indeed, when we turn to the question of absolute mobility, asking a very different question. So here's one way to think about it. When you're born, the stork, of course, takes you to your new house, right? And let's say that the Palo Alto stork was tasked with delivering you to your new home. And the question that's embedded when we ask about relative mobility is whether it matters where that stork drops you. And in particular, does it matter whether the stork drops you into a high income household, as might be found in Palo Alto, or flies just a bit further in this case and takes you to a lower income household in East Palo Alto? Does that matter for your subsequent adult earnings? Now, the answer, based on long tradition of research, is that it matters a lot where the stork drops you in terms of how much you're going to make as an adult. What's not yet resolved is whether or not it's mattering ever more. But I want us to just pause for a moment and assume that when the dust settles with respect to this ongoing research literature on trends in relative mobility, if when the dust settles we find that it is mattering ever more where the stork drops you, that relative mobility is declining, as is absolute mobility, if that's what's found, what might be behind that? Why should we be worried, in other words, that that may be found? And I would say the key issue here is the rise of what I've called opportunity markets. It's the rise of opportunity markets that make rising income inequality very problematic. So what do I mean by the rise of opportunity markets? I mean that it increasingly takes money to buy opportunity. So if parents want to do well by their children and raise their chances of making a lot of money when they're adults, they'd be well advised to buy high quality childcare. They probably read the social science literature and they know that matters for future earnings. They'd be well advised to buy a good neighborhood. They probably read the social science literature and know that matters for your future earnings. They'd be well advised to buy good schooling because they've read the social science literature and they know that that too matters. But what's the problem? we have many more substantial human capital investments that are now needed to get ahead, as it were. It's a different game. It's a game that requires substantial human capital investments. Is that a problem? It's a problem if you have to buy them, and you do have to buy them. The last time I checked, you cannot go to the bank and say, give me a loan to make it possible for me to buy a house in Palo Alto. They have wonderful schools, right? So I need a loan so that I can get a house in Palo Alto and my kids can get the training that they need because they're amazing. The bank won't give you that loan against the future earnings of your kid, right? So you're locked out. You can't do it. So insofar as we need to make lots of human capital investments, and insofar as that means the parents need money, we're basically putting opportunity on the market. So the upshot, last slide. The Pope was right. No surprise. Rising inequality is reducing absolute mobility, and it may be reducing relative mobility too. Thank you.
That was terrific. Thank you very much, David. And our final speaker of the day before the Q&A is Florencia Torch. Florencia is a professor of sociology, an expert in social demography, stratification, and education. Florencia's research focuses on the dynamics that result in persistence of inequality across generations, with a focus on educational attainment and the intergenerational transmission of wealth. She has also done some terrific research on the influence of early life exposures on well-being and how these exposures contribute to the persistence of poverty across generations. Florencia is a member of the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Her research is published at the best journals in sociology and other fields, and her work has received funding from the National Science Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the Spencer Foundation, among many others. Now, I've been a fan of Florencia's research for a long time, but what I discovered when I became the Senior Associate Dean for the Social Sciences is just how incredibly helpful Florencia is as a colleague and how committed she is to the public good, and in particular to the social sciences and to the School of HNS. So thank you so much, Florencia, and welcome, and thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Ran. It's a treat to be here and to be part of this conversation. So let's get started, ideally from the beginning. All right, so I'm gonna talk about higher education and in particular college education and income inequality in the US today. Before we get started, I want to say that college graduates enjoy many advantages in the US and everywhere. They have higher incomes for sure, but they also enjoy better health and lower mortality, live more stable lives, commit fewer crimes, and participate more in civic life, among other advantages. So even if I'm going to focus on the economic returns to a college degree, I want to at least mention that the advantages associated with higher education vastly transcend the economic, the pecuniary domain. But today I'm going to focus on economic outcomes and economic inequality in particular. And to do so, I will address three questions. First, who graduates from college in America today, or over time in America actually? What is the economic payoff of a college degree? And thirdly, who benefits more from college? That is the effect of college greater for some groups than other groups? I want to present some stylized facts on these three questions for you, and then we'll discuss implications for the future of inequality in the US, okay? So let's get started with the very basics. The first is to show you the college graduation rates in the US, and this is by birth cohort, that is by year of birth, right? From those born in the 1930s all the way to those born in the 1980s. As you see here, there is an overall improvement. This increase reaching now about 40% of the more recent cohorts, birth cohorts. This increase is, however, not exceptional if we take a comparative perspective. what I'm showing here is a set of advanced industrial, of wealthy countries, right? Of countries similar to the US in that dimension. And these plots, the proportion of the population with higher education among those born in between 1955 to 64, compared to those born between 1985 and 94, so, you know, more recently. And oops, I'm sorry about this. What we see here is the US, right? The US, as you can see, the improvement has been minor compared to similar countries, right? The US was a leader among the more senior cohort, but now it has been surpassed by several other countries. It's important to say at the outset that this overall increase in college graduation that I show you is very different if we break it down by gender. So the solid line is for men, and you see across cohorts, across years of birth, you see virtual stagnation over time in the US among men. For women instead, we see an improvement such that the improvement in the recent time in the US is mostly driven by women, and I'm happy to talk more about this. But let me go more specifically to the question, my first question, right? Who is graduating from college based on socioeconomic sources of socioeconomic advantage? This is based on work by my colleague, Michelle Jackson and Holzman, and here they show the proportion of college graduates across year of birth. This is men, right? And this is for men. At the bottom of the income distribution, the red line shows men at the 10th percentile of the income distribution, so in poverty, basically. And the green line shows men at living in families, in households that are at the top of the income distribution, the 90th percentile, so, you know, upper middle class, or, you know, upper class, frankly. And we see here that the increase in college graduation is concentrated at the top. At the bottom, there's no increase whatsoever over many decades, right? This is by parents' income. This is who is getting to college by parents' income. Let me do the same by race and ethnicity, another very relevant dimension of socioeconomic advantage in American society. Here, what I plot is the rates of college graduation for non-Hispanic whites. This is the dotted line. For non-Hispanic Blacks, this is the dashed line. And finally, for Hispanics, that's a solid line. And what you see here is that all groups experience some improvement, but whites experience in absolute term larger improvements, such that over time, the gap across racial ethnic groups has not only not closed, but also increased, right? So this addresses our first question. Who graduates from college? Well, the gaps in college graduation based on parents' income and based on race and ethnicity are growing, or at least they're not closing as college education expands. To our second question, well, what about the payoff to a college degree? Because this is in part why this matters. So this shows the college versus high school wage gap over time. This is across years, right? From the 60s to the present. This shows how much more do college graduates make compared to high school graduates, right? In the 70s, they made about 50 to 60% more. This payoff has increased such that today, or in the 2010s, they make twice as much, 100% more. Again, a comparative approach is always very useful to put the findings in context. Here again, what I show is a set of wealthy countries, right? And what is plotted here is the returns to education, the economic returns, the money returns to education, how much more you make for each additional year of college or higher education, right? And as we see, compared to this set of countries, the US is towards the very top, right? The payoff of higher education is rather high in the US compared to similar countries. I want to get a little deeper in this question about the economic payoff of a college degree in America. And for this, we're gonna see here the real earnings received by groups that have different levels of education over time, using 1963 as our baseline, right? So this is real earnings over time, meaning adjusted by inflation. So it's the real money that you have in your pocket, basically. And what we see is that over time, those without a high school degree have done worse than in 1960. So no gains for them at all. And then if you move up in the educational distribution, those with a bachelor's degree are doing better. And in particular, those with more than a bachelor degree are doing exceedingly better, right? So the educational elite in the US is doing a lot better than before. And is it clear from this figure, there's a widening in the gap, right, across people with different levels of schooling. This is for men. Let me show you for women. The pattern is rather similar for men and for women. So with this, let me address our second question. The economic payoff of a college degree has increased over the last few decades in the US, and it is large compared to similar countries. Now to my third question. Who benefits more from college in the US? So far, I've shown you associations, correlations, empirical associations, right? The association between different levels of schooling and earnings, say. The third question, who benefits more from college, is about the causal with a capital C effect of a college degree on outcomes, on economic outcomes. And this question is very challenging to address, because in order to address this causal question, we need to isolate the effect of college education from the characteristics of people who attain a college degree, right? I mean, college graduates might be exceedingly bright, and that is what may explain their economic benefits, rather than anything that college gives them, right? College as a treatment that helps people attain things. Many scholars in the social sciences have addressed this question, and there is, in my view, growing evidence that suggests that a college degree has a stronger causal effect on earnings among disadvantaged people, disadvantaged youth. Those people who are less likely to attend college, right? What is the reason for this higher payoff, this higher causal effect of attaining a college degree? It's because the earnings of disadvantaged people without a college degree would be extremely low, right? So they gain a lot, but making it there, but attaining the degree. And more than youth that come from more advantaged backgrounds who wouldn't do as poorly if they don't get a college degree. Let me be clear, this answer is not fully conclusive. There is a lot of research being done, but there is growing evidence from different sources that suggest this heterogeneous effect of college benefiting more disadvantaged youth more. So with this, I'm gonna quickly take stock. And I have to say, I'm not bringing good news, right? Over time, the attainment of a college degree has become more unequal based on family income and race ethnicity. At the same time, the economic payoff of a college degree has increased in America. If you put these two trends together, these trends do not bode well for the future of economic inequality or for economic mobility that David discussed in the US, right? Although we need to keep looking at more recent evidence. these trends suggest a very interesting policy discussion. They have many policy implications. I'm not going to discuss those right now, but I just wanted to highlight this finding that the stronger positive effect of a college degree on earnings among disadvantaged youth offers offers one way forward, right? Promoting college graduation among disadvantaged communities provides a plausible opportunity to both reduce inequality and, of course, increase intergenerational mobility. So with this, I close, and thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Florencia, and this was fascinating, and thank you all for great presentations. I was actually originally planning to ask you a couple of questions, but you know, we are short on time, and we have many questions from the audience, so I think we'll go directly there. And I want to invite again Tamri Matiashvili to moderate the Q&A. And Tamri grew up in Georgia the country, not the state, and she will be starting her PhD in the economics department at Stanford next fall. And she's very interested in the topic of inequality. She's planning to study the unique inequalities faced by the citizens of the USSR, as well as the high inequalities that emerged in the post-Soviet countries. And so thanks very much, Tamri, for joining and for moderating the Q&A today.
Ron, thank you so much for having me again, and thanks to all the panelists for fascinating and interdisciplinary talks we've heard. I'll jump right in because we have a lot of questions. So the first question is for Deborah Zatz. What can universities do to educate students about income inequality so that the issue is one they understand as having moral consequences?
A great question. I mean, I think as you've heard from the panel, there are a lot of very complex social scientific questions around inequality. But of course, the social science doesn't dictate the, either the values that are at stake or the trade-offs that people are willing to make between those values, and to help people just think about what are the different dimensions of value. For a number of years, Ken Arrow, well-known, unfortunately late economist, and I taught a course on the ethics and economics of inequality that tried to bring both the valuative and the empirical issues together. I think that's incredibly important to do, and particularly important to think about what are the things we have to take as givens, and what are the things where our normative considerations could actually move the needle on some things. So I think we have an opportunity. We have a new citizenship course being piloted for freshmen, and it's going to look at questions of relevance to citizenship. And obviously, issues about inequality in different dimensions are important to citizens, because democracies have the view that citizens must be treated equally in some respects, and then identifying what those respects are and where those respects are being violated is critical for anybody who is going to take up the role of a citizen in the 21st century.
Thank you so much. Oh, thanks so much, Professor Zatz. And the next question is for Professor Torch. While the crude college graduation indicator seems important, I wonder what role the quality of education plays. For example, if we reached 100% higher educational attainment, would employers simply switch to valuing private, expensive institutions of higher education, leading to more parents' income-driven inequality based on education?
Thank you for that interesting question. Certainly, there's a lot of research on this, and it refers in part to the signaling role of education, right? If a signal loses power, then we need to find another signal. There's also the so-called human capital value of education, right? That would help individuals in addition to the signal, but signaling or what the credential displays is important, and that results in educational expansion being kind of a moving target if your interest is inequality. Why is that? Because if there's a competition among households, right, that have different resources to get them the most they can for their children, as David was explaining, and then there's a realization that a higher, a better, so-called better, more prestigious signal is required. Then there's the next location in which that competition for unequal rewards should take place. So it will take place. So this means for those concerned with inequality, a constant assessment of the difference that makes the difference, basically, right? What is the location that is creating novel differences in society and tackling that? I am only concentrating very specifically on inequality outcomes. Of course, education plays other incredibly important roles beyond that, but that's an important consideration that, of course, policymakers should consider rather carefully.
Thank you so much, Professor Torch. And then the next question is Professor Grusky. For much of our history, Americans have thought social mobility was possible for all, but we now know that there are many reasons that is not always true. Can you talk about some of the reasons that is not true in modern America and how we might address those challenges?
All in 1 minute, right? Yeah, there are some fundamental challenges in play in trying to equalize opportunity. We have built into a host of our institutions unequal opportunities to get ahead, and I think one of the opportunities that we have is that in trying to undertake the radical institutional reform that's going to be needed to unwind that unequal opportunity that's built into our institutions, in doing that, we will also, I think, increase economic growth. Because it's the lack of opportunity that, again, is built into so many of our institutions that's not making it possible for people to realize their talents and to do what they could otherwise do were they given a chance. So what sorts of reforms are needed? Well, first off, we need to provide equal opportunities for early childhood education of a high quality sort. We don't do that, and that has consequences down the line. We don't provide equal opportunities for people to live in good neighborhoods. We require that. We require parents to have the money that's needed to get into the neighborhood that we know now have payoffs. So we need to make it possible for people of all income levels, of all ethnic and racial groups to live together in the same neighborhoods and partake in high quality educational training. We need to, of course, undertake reform in our criminal justice system, because that too is a very unequal system that's hitting some groups much more than others, and that then has downstream implications on adult earnings. So what we need, in short, is a thoroughgoing overhaul of all of the various institutions that contribute to unequal opportunity. And if we did that, we'd be getting rid of some of the most pernicious sources of inequality.
Thank you, Professor Grusky. And it looks like we are nearing the end of our webinar. So this is the last question for Professor Boskin. What makes corporate taxation the most harmful to forward economic progress? Isn't it a more efficient way for the government to make money without taking directly from the people?
Well, first of all, corporations are owned by people. Corporations are just a legal entity. They have shareholders. Those shareholders include, importantly, pension funds of school teachers and many others, public employees and private employees. All economists try to figure out what the net effect of that tax is and on whom it falls. And the modern theory of that and the modern empirical evidence suggests that part of it falls on workers' wages, because high corporate taxes lead to decreased investment, which decreases future productivity for workers. So the main issue with corporate taxation is it harms incentives to invest. I might say, given the tenor of what everybody has said, which I kind of, in the last few minutes and the presentations, which I qualitatively agree with, I think we have to be very careful not to undermine, while we're trying to create equal opportunity and all those things, not to undermine meritocracy, because to keep that as part of the mix, because the fundamental thing that drives an economy to improve living standards are people's natural desire to get ahead, to improve things, including to have things better for their children. So I think we have to be very careful about that. So while we need to provide greater opportunity, remove obstacles, things like occupational licensure that make it very hard for somebody to get into a job they can do and earn a living. The Arab Spring started when an Arab street merchant wasn't allowed to sell vegetables on the street corner. So there's a lot we could do in that regard, but it's important we promote economic growth. And I would disassociate myself from the comments that greater inequality harms total output. I think they have complex interrelationships in both directions. So it's something that needs to be sensibly balanced given the important social science evidence on these things.
Well, thank you, first of all, to the audience for these great questions. And as always, I will make available a list of readings for the students based on today's presentations. And this has been a really terrific discussion. So thank you so much, Deborah, Mike, David, and Florencia for your fabulous presentations. And thank you, Tamri, for moderating the Q&A so well. And thank you all for joining. I will see you next week. We will talk about immigration in the American dream.
Thank you.